Have you ever been told what you can or can't wear on your own property by someone who clearly has no idea who they're messing with? It's a strange feeling, isn't it? That mix of disbelief and irritation. Today, I'm going to tell you about Agnes Periwinkle, an HOA president who genuinely believed her power was absolute, especially when she decided to target a new resident, a veteran, simply for his choice of work pants. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that some old habits, some deep-seated loyalties, and some old friends, while they die hard. Stick around to see how a humble pair of camouflage pants ignited a quiet war in suburbia and led to a takedown of truly epic proportions. Where are you all watching from today? I'd love to hear. And let me know in the comments below if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA, or any petty tyrant for that matter, that went way too far. My story, or rather, the story of Master Sergeant, retired Jack Sterling, began not on a battlefield, but in the deceptively peaceful cul-de-sacs of the Oakhaven Estates. Jack had traded the arid deserts and rugged mountains of his former life for green lawns and the promise of quiet mornings. After 20-plus years in special forces, the kind of service that etched itself onto a man's soul and into the very lines on his face, he was looking for an entirely different kind of engagement. Retirement. He'd bought a modest house, one with a decent-sized yard and a garage he planned to convert into a workshop. His movements were still precise, economical, a testament to years of training. But his eyes, though they missed nothing, sought tranquility now, not targets. He was unassuming. Neighbors saw a man in his late 40s, still fit, who kept to himself mostly, offering a polite nod or a quiet hello. They didn't see the commendations packed away in a footlocker or the ghosts of operations past that sometimes flickered in his gaze when he thought no one was looking. He was simply Mr. Sterling, the new guy at number 17, the one who seemed to spend a lot of time thoughtfully considering his overgrown rose bushes as if they were a complex strategic problem. And in a way, for Jack, they were. They were a problem he could solve with pruning shears and patience, a welcome change from the tools and tactics of his past. He wanted order, yes, the kind that came from a well-tended garden and a predictable schedule, not the arbitrary, suffocating order imposed by others. Agnes Periwinkle, on the other hand, thrived on imposed order. She was the president of the Oakhaven Homeowners Association, a position she wielded not as a service, but as a scepter. She was a woman of a certain age, with hair sculpted into a rigid helmet and eyes that seemed to perpetually narrow in disapproval. Her patrols of a neighborhood were legendary, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her gaze sweeping for infractions, a rogue dandelion, a trash can lingering curbside a minute past the allotted time, a non-regulation garden gnome. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of the HOA bylaws, particularly the sections she had personally championed or those vague enough to allow for broad, self-serving interpretation. To Agnes, Oakhaven Estates wasn't a community. It was her fiefdom and the residents, her subjects. Her voice, a surprisingly resonant contralto, could often be heard delivering pronouncements on the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, usually to some poor soul who dared to paint their mailbox a non-approved shade of beige. The inciting incident, the spark that lit the fuse, occurred on a Tuesday. Jack had spent the morning wrestling with a stubborn stump in his backyard. It was heavy, dirty work. He was wearing an old pair of camo cargo pants, faded from countless washes, comfortable, practical, and utterly unremarkable in his world. They were his go-to for any task that involved dirt or exertion. He'd just hauled a final load of roots to the curb and was catching his breath, leaning against his pickup truck, when Agnes's shadow fell over him. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice devoid of any warmth, each syllable clipped. Jack straightened up, wiping a smear of dirt from his forehead. "Afternoon, Mrs. Periwinkle." Her eyes, like a hawk's, zeroed in on his trousers. A flicker of something distaste, outrage, crossed her face. "Mr. Sterling, I must address your attire." Jack glanced down at his pants, then back at her, a flicker of bemusement in his eyes. "My attire? For yard work. Is there a problem?" "Indeed, there is," Agnes stated, tapping her pen against her clipboard. Article 7, Section B, Subsection 4 of the Oakhaven Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions clearly states that all residents must maintain a standard of dress that contributes to the harmonious and aesthetically pleasing environment of our community. She paused for dramatic effect. Your military-style garments are, frankly, intimidating and not in keeping with the visual standards we strive to uphold. They are, to put it plainly, unsuitable. Jack blinked slowly. He'd faced down men with RPGs who'd shown more nuance. These are work pants, Mrs. Periwinkle. Camouflage. Practical for not showing dirt. Practicality does not supersede the bylaws, Mr. Sterling, she sniffed. This is a residential community, not a bivouac. Such displays can be upsetting to other residents. They are suggestive of aggression, of conflict. We cultivate peace here. Peace, Jack thought, a muscle tightening in his jaw. You have no idea what peace is, lady, or what it costs. Aloud, he kept his tone even. I can assure you, no aggression is intended. They're just pants. Nevertheless, Agnes said, her voice hardening, I must insist you change into something more appropriate. And consider this a formal warning. Future violations will incur fines. She made a brisk note on her clipboard. We expect conformity to community standards. It's what maintains our property values, you understand, she then added, with a dismissive wave of her hand toward his pants. Frankly, that sort of thing is best left in the past, where it belongs. We're trying to build a respectable neighborhood here. The sheer audacity of it, the condescension, the casual disrespect for something that, for Jack, was far more than just a pattern on cloth, struck a nerve deep inside him. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of his youth, but a cold, steady burn. He said nothing, just watched her turn on her heel and march away, her back ramrod straight. He looked down at his camo pants, the fabric that had been a second skin in places she couldn't imagine, places where real harmony and peace were fragile, precious commodities bought at great cost. A formal warning. For his pants. In his own yard. All right, Agnes, he thought, a grim sort of determination settling in. You want to talk about standards? Let's talk about standards. The battle lines, it seemed, had just been drawn over a pair of cargo pants. The crisp white envelope delivered to his mailbox the next day contained the official written warning, complete with a photocopied, heavily highlighted, and largely irrelevant section of the CC and RS. Jack read it, a humorless smile touching his lips. Fine, $25 for inappropriate attire, escalating to $50 for a second offense. It was absurd. It was insulting. But more than that, it was a misuse of power, however petty. His initial reaction was a familiar one. Analyze the threat, understand the operational environment, identify weaknesses, formulate a response. The desire for a quiet life was strong, but his ingrained intolerance for bullies, for any abuse of authority, was stronger. This isn't about the $25, he mused, turning the ridiculous piece of paper over in his hands. This is about principle. He remembered his first drill sergeant, a man whose voice could peel paint, bellowing, "Details, ladies! The devil is in the details, and so is your survival." Jack had taken that lesson to heart. So, he retrieved the thick booklet of HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions he'd received at closing, a document he'd previously skimmed with the same enthusiasm one reserves for assembling flat-pack furniture. Now, however, he approached it like a critical piece of intelligence. He made coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and began to read. Methodically, carefully, highlighting, cross-referencing, making notes in the margins. His years of mission planning, of dissecting complex orders and identifying exploitable loopholes in enemy doctrine, kicked in. The language was dense, often deliberately opaque, but Jack was no stranger to deciphering bureaucratic jargon. He found Article 7, Section B, Subsection 4, the one Agnes had so triumphantly cited. It was, as he suspected, a masterpiece of vague wording. Attire that contributes to the harmonious and aesthetically pleasing environment. There was no mention of specific prohibitions. No list of banned garments. No definition of military style or intimidating. It was entirely subjective, left to the interpretation of the HOA board, or more accurately, its self-appointed grand arbiter, Agnes Periwinkle. Interesting, he thought. No specific prohibition means no specific infraction. He then searched for any rules regarding work attire or clothing worn on one's own property while engaged in manual labor. Nothing. The entire premise of her warning was built on sand, on her personal interpretation and prejudice. His past wasn't just about combat. It was about discipline, observation, and an almost fanatical attention to regulations when it suited the mission. He recalled a short course he'd once taken on understanding legal frameworks in occupied territories, an odd skill to be dredging up for an HOA dispute, but the principles were similar. Know the rules better than your adversary. He felt a familiar calm settle over him, the focus that came when a problem presented itself with clarity. Agnes had made a mistake. She'd overplayed her hand, assuming her authority was unassailable, assuming he was just another resident to be cowed into submission. His preliminary investigation extended beyond the documents. He started observing Agnes with a more focused eye. Her patrol schedule was fairly regular. He noted who she stopped to chat with, a small clique of older residents who seemed to bask in her reflected authority, and who she merely issued clipped directives to. He saw her measuring the height of Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses with a retractable tape measure, a frown etched on her face. He saw her admonish young Timmy Miller for riding his skateboard on the sidewalk, despite the fact that the sidewalks were, by any reasonable definition, deserted. He took a walk around the neighborhood, a friendly, non-threatening stroll, and struck up a few casual conversations. Just getting to know the place, he'd say. Seems like a tight-knit community, the responses were. Guarded. But a few cracks appeared. Old Mr. Rodriguez, tending his immaculate lawn, muttered something about that woman and her rules before catching himself. A young mother, wrestling a stroller and a toddler, rolled her eyes when Jack mentioned the HOA's diligence. Diligent is one word for it, she'd said with a wry smile. He wasn't the only one chafing under Agnes's reign. The intelligence picture was becoming clearer. Agnes was a petty dictator, ruling by intimidation and a skewed interpretation of vaguely written rules. And like all such regimes, she likely had vulnerabilities. He just needed to find them. The $25 fine was no longer the issue. It was the principle. And Master Sergeant Jack Sterling, retired or not, always stood on principle. Jack knew that taking on an entrenched figure like Agnes Periwinkle wasn't a solo mission. He needed allies, people on the inside, or at least people who shared his desire for a more reasonable community. His casual conversations had given him a few leads, a few names of residents who seemed less than enamored with Agnes's leadership. He decided to start with Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman whose roses had been subjected to Agnes's meticulous scrutiny. He found her tending her garden, her expression a mixture of pride and anxiety. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Jack said, offering a warm smile. "Your roses are looking magnificent." She straightened up, a pleased look momentarily chasing away the worry. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Sterling. They're my pride and joy." Though Agnes seems to think they're a millimeter too tall for regulation, she sighed, her shoulders slumping a little. "It's always something. I receive and notice myself," Jack said, keeping his tone light. "About my work pants, of all things." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened slightly. "Oh dear. Her and her aesthetic harmony last month, it was my bird feeder. Apparently, it attracted undesirable elements, meaning squirrels, I suppose. Had to take it down." She gestured to a bare spot near a tree. "The birds miss it. I miss it." Here was a fellow victim, someone directly impacted by Agnes's overreach. "That doesn't seem right," Jack said sympathetically. "I've been reading the CC and RS. They're rather vague on many points." "Vague for us, specific for her," Mrs. Henderson said with a surprising flash of acerbic wit. "She makes them up as she goes along, I swear." Jack then approached David Chun, the young father he'd seen, getting an earful about his children's basketball hoop. David was initially wary, clearly not wanting more trouble, But when Jack explained his own situation and his methodical review of the bylaws, David's frustration bubbled to the surface. It's ridiculous. The kids were playing. I brought it in as soon as they were done. She fined me for improper storage of recreational equipment. My kids can't even be kids in their own yard. The final piece of his initial alliance puzzle was Mr. Abernathy, a retired accountant who lived on the next street. Jack had heard him grumbling at a distance about HOA finances during one of Agnes's pronouncements at the community notice board. Approaching him required a bit more finesse. Mr. Abernathy was known to be a stickler for rules himself, but also for fairness and transparency. Jack found him meticulously washing his car. "Mr. Abernathy," Jack began, "I'm Jack Sterling, new to the neighborhood. I was hoping I could pick your brain about something, if you have a moment." Abernathy eyed him shrewdly. "Depends what it's about." "It's about the HOA," Jack said. "Specifically about how some of the rules are interpreted and enforced. And perhaps," he added carefully, "about the financials." That got Abernathy's attention. "The financials, you say?" A new light came into his eyes. "They haven't released a detailed expenditure report in over a year, despite requests. Just summaries. Always summaries." Over the next week, this small, informal group began to meet discreetly, usually in Jack's garage, which was still mostly empty boxes and potential. Jack laid out his findings on the bylaws, showing them the lack of concrete rules supporting Agnes's many edicts. Mrs. Henderson brought a list of petty fines she'd accumulated. David Chun recounted instances of Agnes watching his house, seemingly waiting for an infraction. Mr. Abernathy, with his accountant's eye, explained what they should be looking for in HOA financial documents, if they could ever get their hands on them. Trust began to build, fueled by shared grievances and Jack's calm, methodical approach. He wasn't a hothead looking for a fight. He was a planner, seeking justice. Their in-depth investigation began. Mr. Abernathy, now fully engaged, formally requested detailed financial statements and meeting minutes going back 2 years, citing specific clauses in the HOA bylaws that mandated their availability to homeowners. Agnes, through her secretary, stalled, providing only heavily redacted summaries or claiming records were in archive. This, of course, only fueled their suspicions. Jack, meanwhile, put his old surveillance skills to use, albeit in a strictly legal and non-invasive way. He started documenting Agnes's own adherence, or lack thereof, to the myriad of rules she so zealously enforced. He took a discreet photo from his own property of Agnes's lawn service blowing grass clippings into the street, a clear violation of the landscaping guidelines she'd authored. He noted her habit of parking her oversized sedan slightly over the sidewalk when visiting her friends in the clique, obstructing pedestrian passage, another finable offense according to her own standards. It was petty, yes, but it was evidence of hypocrisy, a powerful weapon in any campaign against an autocrat. They discovered a pattern. Fines were often levied against newer residents or those who had dared to question Agnes in the past. Favors like prime slots for community garden plots or leniency on minor infractions seemed to go to her inner circle. Mr. Abernathy, piecing together the scant financial data they had, found that a disproportionate amount of money was being spent on landscaping enhancements contracted to a company, Periwinkle's Perfect Petunias, which, with a little digging online, Jack discovered was co-owned by Agnes's cousin. The contract amounts were significantly higher than competitive bids obtained by Mr. Abernathy for similar services. Agnes, for her part, seemed to sense the shift in the air, the subtle resistance. Jack had formally appealed his camo pants fine, submitting a polite but firm letter detailing the lack of any specific prohibition in the bylaws. Agnes had summarily rejected it, her response curt and dismissive. "The board's interpretation is final," she then escalated. Jack received a notice that his front lawn was 1/4 of an inch too high in one section, then another for placing his recycling bin 6 inches too far from the curb. It was blatant harassment. She also started a whispering campaign. That Mr. Sterling, she'd confide to her cronies, loud enough for others to overhear, he's a disruptive influence. Not the sort of person we want in Oak Haven. Probably has issues, you know, from his previous employment. Her arrogance, however, was her Achilles heel. She couldn't imagine that her reign was genuinely threatened. She saw Jack not as a strategic opponent, but as a minor irritant to be swatted away. She underestimated him, badly, and Jack knew, from long experience, that being underestimated was often the greatest advantage of all. The game was afoot, and Agnes was playing right into his hands. The small team, now calling themselves the Oakhaven Residents for Fairness, or ORF, knew they needed a concrete plan. Sporadic resistance and quiet grumbling wouldn't dislodge Agnes. They needed to consolidate their findings, mobilize broader support, and choose their moment carefully. Jack's garage transformed from a storage space into an impromptu strategy room, with a whiteboard listing grievances, potential allies, and sections of the HOA bylaws that Agnes had twisted or ignored. She controls the regular meetings, David Chin pointed out, frustration lacing his voice. She sets the agenda. Her cronies on the board shut down any real discussion. We need a way to force the issue. Mr. Abernathy, poring over the CC and RS yet again, found their opening. Article 12, he announced, tapping a page. A special meeting can be called by a petition signed by 20% of homeowners. At that meeting, the petitioners can set the agenda. 20%, Jack mused. That's achievable. We have a solid base of people who are unhappy. We just need to convince them to sign. He looked at the faces around him. Mrs. Henderson, resolute despite her gentle demeanor. David, fired up by the injustice to his family. Mr. Abernathy, his accountant's mind relishing the hunt for financial impropriety. They were a good team. Their strategy solidified. First, gather the signatures for a special meeting. Second, prepare a comprehensive presentation detailing Agnes's overreach, her misinterpretation of bylaws, the evidence of hypocrisy, and Mr. Abernathy's preliminary findings on financial irregularities. Third, present this at the special meeting, aiming for a vote of no confidence and a demand for a full, independent audit. And then there was the Camo pants incident. That's our symbol, Jack said quietly. It's personal for me, yes, but it's also something everyone can understand. It's the perfect example of her petty tyranny, her making rules where none exist, he paused. And I have an idea about how to underscore that point. This was where Jack decided to reach out to some old friends. He made a few calls. These weren't men you summon lightly. They were brothers, forged in crucibles Agnes Periwinkle couldn't even imagine. He explained the situation, the absurd demand about his camo pants, the broader pattern of abuse. He didn't ask them to intervene officially. That would be impossible and wrong. He asked if, as private citizens, as his friends, they might be willing to attend an HOA meeting to offer moral support, to simply be present. He knew their very presence, their quiet professionalism, their shared history that needed no words, would send a powerful message. The responses were immediate and affirmative. Just tell us when and where, Jack. We'll be there, they understood. It wasn't about a war. It was about backing up a brother when he was taking a stand against a bully on his own turf. Their attendance would be perfectly legal, entirely peaceful, yet psychologically potent. While Jack and the ORF discreetly gathered signatures, going door to door in the evenings, explaining their concerns, Agnes continued her reign, oblivious to the storm gathering beneath her. She pushed through a new amendment at a sparsely attended regular HOA meeting, one that vaguely prohibited attire deemed by the board to be potentially alarming or disruptive to community tranquility. It was clearly aimed at Jack, a retroactive justification for her actions. She also instructed the HOA's part-time secretary to misplace certain financial records Mr. Abernathy had again requested, claiming they were under review for archiving. Her confidence bordered on delusion. She believed any opposition was fragmented, easily quashed. The stakes were rising. Agnes, perhaps getting wind of increased chatter, began to target Jack's known associates more directly. Mrs. Henderson received a notice that the color of her garden hose was non-compliant. David Chun was warned about excessive noise when his children were laughing in their backyard during the daytime. These were transparent attempts at intimidation, designed to isolate Jack and frighten his allies into silence. But it had the opposite effect. It solidified their resolve. Each petty act of aggression only added another signature to the petition, another voice ready to speak out. Jack remained the picture of calm, though a familiar tension hummed beneath the surface. This was a different kind of campaign, one fought with bylaws and proxies instead of bullets and breaches, but the core principles remained. Know your enemy, know your terrain, maintain discipline, and execute with precision. He meticulously coached his allies on how to respond to Agnes's provocations, politely, firmly, and always with a reference back to the written rules, or the lack thereof. He felt a resurgence of purpose he hadn't anticipated. He'd come to Oakhaven seeking peace, but perhaps true peace wasn't a passive state, but something actively defended, even in the smallest of arenas. The petition's signatures climbed steadily. They would have their special meeting, and Agnes Periwinkle was about to have a very, very bad day. The community hall, normally used for sparse monthly HOA meetings and the occasional potluck, was packed. Word had spread. The petition for a special meeting had easily surpassed the required 20%, a silent testament to the widespread discontent Agnes had cultivated. She sat at the head table, flanked by her two staunchest allies on the board, a nervous-looking treasurer named Arthur Jenkins and a perpetually scowling woman named Doris Finch. Agnes's expression was one of severe displeasure, like a queen forced to entertain a delegation of particularly impertinent peasants. She banged the gavel with unnecessary force. "This special meeting," she began, her voice tight, "has been called based on a petition which, frankly, I find to be based on misunderstandings and misinformation. However, the bylaws require we convene. The floor is open to the petitioners, but I will remind everyone that decorum and adherence to Robert's Rules of Order will be strictly enforced." Jack stood up, calm and composed. He held a simple folder. "Thank you, Madam President," he said, his voice even and carrying easily through the hall. "We, the undersigned residents of Oakhaven Estates, have called this meeting to address several serious concerns regarding the governance of our community, the interpretation and enforcement of our CC and RS, and the financial transparency of this association." He began systematically laying out the case. He spoke of the harmonious and aesthetically pleasing environment clause, demonstrating how it was being used not to foster harmony, but to impose arbitrary personal preferences. He detailed his own experience with the camouflage pants, producing the warning letter and then reading the actual, vague bylaw, highlighting the disconnect. A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson then stood, her voice trembling slightly but firm, and spoke of her bird feeder and the nonsensical fine for her roses. David Chin followed, his anger controlled but palpable, as he described the harassment over his children's play. Each story was a small chip at Agnes's authority. Agnes attempted to interrupt, to rule them out of order. "This is not a forum for airing personal grievances," she declared. "We are discussing policy. We are discussing the misapplication of policy, Madam President," Jack countered smoothly, "and its impact on the residents you were elected to serve." Mr. Abernathy then took the floor, his delivery dry but devastating, as he outlined the questions surrounding the HOA's finances. He detailed the lack of transparency, the stonewalling of requests for detailed records, and the suspiciously high landscaping contract awarded to Periwinkle's perfect petunias. He presented comparative bids from other local companies, showing a significant discrepancy. Arthur Jenkins, the treasurer, began to squirm in his seat, avoiding eye contact with Agnes. It was at this point, as Agnes was sputtering about unsubstantiated allegations and disrespect for the board's diligent work, that the main doors at the back of the hall opened quietly. 6 men walked in. They were not in uniform. They were dressed in neat, casual civilian clothing, jeans or khakis, simple shirts. But there was an unmistakable aura about them. They were all fit, their movements economical, their expressions calm, observant. They moved with a quiet confidence that filled the space around them. They took up positions along the back wall, not speaking, not overtly threatening, just present. Jack paused in his presentation, a subtle acknowledgement passing between him and the newcomers. He turned back to the stunned room, and specifically to Agnes, whose jaw had literally dropped. "Madam President," Jack said, his voice retaining its even keel, "these are some friends of mine. They were interested in seeing how a community like Oakhaven operates. Some of them," he added, his gaze unwavering, "have worn camouflage in service to this country, in places and circumstances I'm sure you would find far more intimidating and unsuitable than my backyard. They simply came to observe." The atmosphere in the hall shifted palpably. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sudden, stark recalibration of power. Agnes Periwinkle, who derived her strength from berating elderly women about bird feeders and young fathers about basketball hoops, now found herself facing the quiet, steady regard of men who had faced down threats she couldn't comprehend. Her carefully constructed facade of authority began to crack. Doris Finch, beside her, looked pale. Even the residents who had been hesitant before seemed to sit up straighter. Agnes, flustered, banged her gavel again, a hollow, tinny sound now. This is highly irregular. These men are not residents. They have no standing here." One of Jack's friends, a tall man with eyes that seemed to see everything, spoke for the first time, his voice calm, polite, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "We are guests of Master Sergeant Sterling, ma'am," he said, the honorific Master Sergeant subtly emphasizing Jack's true stature. "Here purely as observers. We find local governance fascinating." His tone was impeccably courteous, but the underlying message was crystal clear. They were there for Jack. A resident near the front, emboldened, stood up. "Actually, Agnes, I think it's your governance we find fascinatingly awful." Others chimed in, a dam of frustration bursting. Stories of petty fines, of her dismissive attitude, of her favoritism, poured out. The carefully managed order of Agnes's meetings had shattered. The turning point had arrived, not with a shout, but with the quiet entrance of a few good men and the courage it ignited in others. Agnes Periwinkle was no longer in control. The momentum in the room was undeniable. Agnes Periwinkle, for perhaps the first time in her tenure as HOA president, looked utterly lost. Her attempts to regain control, to shout down the residents, now openly airing their grievances, were futile. Her voice, usually so commanding, became shrill, edged with panic. "Order! I demand order! These accusations are baseless. This is a personal attack, orchestrated by Mr. Sterling." "No," Agnes called out Mrs. Henderson, her voice surprisingly strong. "This is accountability. Something you've avoided for far too long." It was Mr. Abernathy who made the formal move. He stood, adjusted his glasses, and addressed the remaining board members, pointedly ignoring Agnes. "Given the serious questions raised tonight regarding financial mismanagement, conflicts of interest, and a consistent pattern of abuse of authority by President Periwinkle, I move for a vote of no confidence in her leadership." David Chun immediately seconded the motion. "And I further move for an immediate, independent audit of all HOA finances for the past 3 years. Agnes slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Out of order. This is an outrage. You can't just." But the residents were having none of it. "Vote! Vote! Vote!" The chant began low at first, then swelling. Arthur Jenkins, the treasurer, looked like he was about to be physically ill. Doris Finch stared straight ahead, her face a mask of fury, but even she seemed to realize the tide had irrevocably turned against them. The quiet presence of Jack's friends at the back of the room served as a silent, unshakable backdrop to the community's uprising. They didn't say a word, didn't move, yet their solidarity with Jack amplified the courage of everyone else. One of the other board members, a quiet man named Peterson who had rarely spoken in meetings, finally found his voice. I think we need to vote on the motion, Agnes." The vote was a landslide. Hands shot up across the room in favor of no confidence. Agnes's reign was over, not with a whimper, but with the roar of a community finally finding its voice. She was officially stripped of her presidency. The motion for an independent audit also passed overwhelmingly. Arthur Jenkins, when pressed, mumbled that he would cooperate fully. Doris Finch sat in stunned silence. Agnes Periwinkle stood, her face contorted in an ugly sneer. "You'll all regret this," she hissed. "This neighborhood will fall apart without proper leadership." She then stormed out of the hall, nearly tripping over a chair in her haste. The image was pathetic, a stark contrast to the composed dignity of the man she had tried to bully over a pair of pants. Her power, built on intimidation and the minutiae of misapplied rules, had crumbled under the weight of collective truth and quiet strength. Jack felt a profound sense of relief, not just for himself, but for his neighbors. The initial injustice over his camouflage pants had been the catalyst, but the victory belonged to the community. His friends approached, clapping him quietly on the shoulder. "Well done, Top," one of them said, using his old and formal title. "Looks like you're still leading from the front." "Just helping out some neighbors," Jack replied with a slight smile. The immediate fines Agnes had levied against him and others were, by consensus of the remaining board and the cheered approval of the residents, declared null and void. Justice, in this small corner of suburbia, had been served. His initial, simple goal, to not be harassed for his choice of workwear, had been achieved, but in the process, something far greater had been set in motion. Oakhaven Estates was finally on the road to becoming a real community, not just a collection of houses governed by fear. In the weeks that followed the tumultuous special meeting, Oakhaven Estates underwent a quiet revolution. An interim HOA board was quickly formed, with Mr. Abernathy unanimously drafted as the acting treasurer and David Chin stepping up to represent the younger families. Jack, despite requests for him to take a leadership role, politely declined an official position. "I'm better at advising from the sidelines," he'd said, though he did agree to sit on a temporary committee tasked with reviewing and rewriting the more ambiguous and problematic sections of the CC and RS. His input, grounded in common sense and a deep respect for fairness, was invaluable. The independent audit, when completed, laid bare the extent of Agnes Periwinkle's mismanagement. While there was no evidence of outright embezzlement that would trigger criminal charges, it revealed a clear pattern of cronyism, particularly with the Periwinkle's Perfect Petunias landscaping contract, which was immediately terminated. There were numerous instances of HOA funds being used for Agnes's personal conveniences, disguised as administrative expenses. The final report recommended that Agnes be formally censured and be requested to repay several $1,000s in questionable expenditures. Whether she would or not was another matter, but her reputation in Oakhaven was irrevocably destroyed. The new board worked diligently. Vague bylaws were clarified with simple, understandable language. The ridiculous rules Agnes had pushed through, like the one implicitly targeting Jack's attire, were rescinded. Transparency became the new watchword. Detailed financial reports were posted monthly on the community website. Meetings became forums for genuine discussion, not dictatorial pronouncements. Mrs. Henderson's bird feeder was reinstalled, a small but potent symbol of the new era. Children's laughter seemed to ring out more freely in the neighborhood. The oppressive atmosphere that Agnes had cultivated lifted like a morning mist. Jack found the peace he had originally sought, but it was a richer, more satisfying peace now. He had not just found a quiet place to live. He had helped make it so. He earned the genuine respect and friendship of his neighbors. His garage workshop slowly took shape, and he often found himself chatting with passersby, offering a tool or a bit of advice. He even started an informal Saturday morning coffee gathering on his driveway for any veterans in the neighborhood, a small group that quickly grew, sharing stories and camaraderie. He realized he hadn't lost his purpose. It had merely shifted its focus from distant battlefields to the community right outside his door. He still wore his old camo pants for yard work, of course. Now, they were just comfortable pants. Their symbolism subtly changed from a point of contention to a quiet reminder of a victory won. As for Agnes Periwinkle, her downfall was complete and socially brutal. She became a pariah. Her former cronies distanced themselves from her. Her daily patrols ceased. She was seen less and less, a bitter, isolated figure in the community she once lorded over. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The news was met not with malice, but with a quiet sense of collective relief. Her enablers on the old board, like Doris Finch, faded into obscurity, their brief taste of power gone. Looking back, Jack often reflected on the chain of events. It started with something as trivial as a pair of pants and escalated into a full-blown referendum on decency and respect. It proved that one person, armed with determination and a refusal to back down from injustice, could indeed make a difference, especially when joined by others who shared that conviction. It taught him that service didn't end when you took off the uniform for the last time. Sometimes, service was about protecting the person next door from petty tyranny, about ensuring your small corner of the world was fair and just. Bullies, he mused, whether on a global stage or in an HOA, thrived on apathy and fear. They crumbled when faced with principled, strategic, and united resistance. And so, Agnes Periwinkle learned a hard lesson. Some uniforms, even when they're just old, faded camo pants worn by a quiet retiree, represent a spirit of resilience that won't be easily broken and a brotherhood that extends far beyond any battlefield, right into the heart of a suburban neighborhood. Oakhaven Estates found a new sense of community, a genuine harmony that Agnes, with all her rules and regulations, could never have manufactured. It all began because one man decided that enough was truly enough. What do you think was the most satisfying part of Agnes's downfall? Was it the public vote, the arrival of Jack's friends, or just the quiet restoration of common sense? Let me know your final thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks for sticking with this story. Remember, sometimes the quietest individuals carry the strongest resolve, and standing up for what's right, even in small ways, can create ripples of significant change. If you enjoyed this tale of justice served and underdog triumph, make sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories. Until next time, take care and stand firm.